Thanks. I appreciate it. And welcome everybody again. It's awesome to have you all here. I appreciate you taking some time out of your days to spend with us here. Hopefully some of these things will be helpful for you. I'm really excited to share some of the things that have worked well for us at Sparkbox. So to start with, got a question for you. How do you know a salesperson is lying? Their mouth is moving, right? And I'm sorry if you're a salesperson. That's I'm not trying to insult folks, but I think that this is sort of a stereotype, right? And I think, you know, salespeople have a bit of a bad rap, unfortunately, especially in an age where we have a lot of conversations around authenticity, right? And authenticity kind of trumps everything almost these days. And what I think I've learned as I've kind of transitioned from a developer, you know, studying computer science, writing a lot of code, working on a lot of projects as a software person, to now sort of leading, working hard to figure out how to lead an organization, a team of folks. It turns out that I've learned that selling actually doesn't have to be slimy, right? That sort of bad reputation side of selling. It's really only like that when you're trying to sell something that people don't need. And so what I'd love to do today, if possible, is to apply some really simple, non-slimy sales concepts to what we're trying to do in the industry with design systems. My hope today is that you're gonna, these kinds of ideas will help you find the budgets and the teams that you need to be able to actually create a more systematic design practice inside your organization. Just a quick bit of context for you. In 2018, my company Sparkbox conducted our first ever design systems survey. And so we just asked folks in the industry, probably some of you, I would hope, maybe some of you participated in it, and thank you for doing that. But we had been doing this kind of more systematic work for years, and we started to see, obviously, you know, the last 3 or 4 years, especially, a lot of momentum in this area. And it turned out that almost every one of our clients was asking for this kind of thing. And so we just wanted to understand it better. And so, you know, we put this survey out, we asked a lot of questions, and we got responses, a lot of responses, lots of different industries, lots of different sized organizations and teams. And we learned a lot. And in terms of the types of folks who responded, everything from, you know, individual contributor, designer, developer type folks, all the way up through product owners, and even executives were answering this. And so it was really cool to get that much feedback. And we learned so much in 2018 that we chose to do it again this year in 2019. And we learned even more. We opened up, there's a line of questioning now that focuses even in on folks who work inside studios like Sparkbox to answer this question, who do work for clients, who help, you know, their customers build systems. And so I just wanted to share this with you. If you'd like to see the results from either of those two surveys, you can do that at this URL. And I'll tell you that, you know, what I'm sharing with you today is really sort of, it's definitely informed by what we learned in those surveys, as well as our own experience doing this kind of work for many very large organizations and very small over the last 4 or 5 years. So that's kind of where everything's coming from. And I actually want to, I know we had talked a little bit before the presentation, but I'm wondering if we can do that poll now in the,
sure.
Yeah, okay, great.
I'm just going to launch it right away. Do you want to be able to vote as well, Ben?
Sure, I'll vote.
Okay, so I just launched it.
Excellent, excellent. And folks, if you have just a moment to answer this question for me, what do you believe the most important factors of a successful system are? So executive champion, do you think that it requires somebody at the top saying, hey, this is important to us? Modern tooling, do you think it's focused really about the kinds of tools, the technologies that are involved? Comprehensive coverage of the app. In other words, what percentage of the interface of the experience is represented in the design system? Having a dedicated team. Do we have folks that are actually, you know, committed to working on this? Or if there's something else that's in mind, if you have in mind, you can choose that other. And I'll give you just a couple more moments here.
And also, well, if you think that it's something other, please do feel free to type it in chat as well. So we can have a conversation about it as well. So far we have 75% voted, and maybe we just leave it for 10 more seconds.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we'll be closing down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and off we go.
Okay, so this is perfect. If you're looking at the results of that, this is very much in line with what we've seen, which is that having a dedicated team, having people available, right, to do the work, is a huge influence. It's more than double everything else. And so thank you all for taking a few minutes to do that for me. I appreciate that. And that actually leads into kind of what I would love to share next, which is just one question that we asked. And this is from the 2018 survey. And one of the things that we wanted to do with these surveys was try to understand what makes a design system work, what makes it successful, sustainable, and what makes it fail, right? And so we asked this question: if you feel that your organization's design system or pattern library was not successful, what were the main reasons? And we saw this idea of a lack of an executive champion, adoption difficulties, and staffing difficulties. So staffing difficulties aligns almost, perfectly with the poll that we just ran, right? There's not enough folks to do the work, or they're not dedicated to the system. And what I learned quickly about this, and you'll notice that in our poll, almost nobody chose the idea of tooling, right? Like it just wasn't the most important thing that kind of surfaced. And this is true with almost everything that we do in this business, which is that these kinds of projects, design systems in particular, don't fail for technical reasons, right? We are lucky to work in such a scrappy industry. If we were to also do a poll about, what did you do before you started doing stuff with web technologies, we would learn that people in this industry came from all kinds of things, right? We would see that they came from, studying different things in school. Some of you probably never went to college or higher education, and that's totally fine. That's one of the reasons I love this business, is because it's full of folks who came to it from a different perspective. And so it's really cool. I love that about us. But that means that we're scrappy. That means these projects aren't going to fail because we can't figure out how to do them, right? It's not about executing. It's actually more about the people that are involved. And so that got me thinking a lot about, as an organization who's trying to do this work to actually help our clients, what is it that I need to be doing, before we actually start doing the actual design and build that will actually help us build something that's going to last. And so, these three kind of things, lack of an executive champion, adoption difficulties, staffing difficulties, all come back to this idea that we maybe haven't brought the right folks into the conversation early enough. And one of the basic things that, if you ever read anything about selling, or about what it takes to actually be a good person in terms of sales, you'll hear this sort of repeated regularly: know your customer. And the basic idea of this, it's a little obvious, but I'll just state it. It's to understand what's valuable to your customer, and then to take the thing that you offer and to present it to them in a way so that they can see how it will actually address that specific concern, how it will be valuable to them, how it will solve their problems. And to be honest, inside of an organization, there's lots of different types of customers for a system. But if you happen to be internal, and you're trying to convince folks internally that a design system is needed, then we're probably talking about the person who's signing the check, right? And what I've learned over the last few years is that there's kind of a couple different spots inside of an organization where a design system tends to live. In my experience, it's one of these two places. So I'll just quickly walk through these. Larger organizations tend to have a group that's sort of IT, right? Information technology. I've seen a trend in the last few years for the name of the IT group to shift to digital services or something along these lines. But it's the same idea. It's the folks who are focused internally on serving the employees of the organization and making sure the technology is serving their the things they need to do. So that's one side, right? A more technical side. And then another side is more traditional marketing or communications. This is, of course, you're familiar with these groups. They're focused more on marketing to customers as opposed to the IT side serving employees. And so these are kind of the two, high level, these are sort of two areas where design systems tend to fall. Now, if you're on the left side, if you're in this IT digital services group, you're typically talking to a CIO or a director of IT, something along those lines. Those are the folks who are going to be able to sign a check and say, yes, this is important to us. This is an initiative we want. And on the marketing communications side, probably a CMO or a communications director, somebody with a similar title. And, just kind of looking at these two sort of, again, high level, and we're making a lot of assumptions here, but at least from my experience, I am seeing a lot of times that a system lives in one of these two places. What we're noticing is that the IT folks tend to be much more internally focused. That's their job, right? They're tasked with serving the rest of the business. And the marketing communications folks are much more externally focused. And so what I've done today is basically work through all of the things that you've probably heard folks talk about over and over and over again, all the different benefits for having a design system. And I've tried to sort of align them with, are they an internal motivator or are they an external motivator? And depending on which they are, it's going to help us re-examine the language that we use to talk about those benefits of a system for folks who happen to be more internally or more externally focused. So I'm going to walk through a few of these with you all. And I want to start with the internal motivators. And, if you've read anything about design systems, anything about what's important and what benefits they offer, it's almost always one of the first things that we talk about is this idea of efficiency. And a lot of times folks are talking about how this allows us, as a team to be able to rapidly prototype new ideas. Maybe we can do that with production ready code from the system, Or this is one that I've definitely felt, which is this idea, and I just call it death by 1,000 decisions. But it's just this concept of like, if I'm trying to solve a new problem, right? There's all these things that I have to think about, right? Just tiny decisions, right? Over and over and over. And when I open up that new CSS file or whatever it is, right? And I have to make these decisions over and over and over again. It's kind of like that sort of creativity is just leaking, and I'm losing momentum on solving the actual problem. Instead, I'm thinking about all these little tiny problems that really are things that should have been solved for us already, And so those are common things that we might talk about if we were just, sitting around a table talking about the benefits of a design system. We also talk about this idea of just simply reusable patterns. Like it can make my job as somebody who's designing and building products, it can make it a lot easier for me. And these things are all great. They're definitely benefits, and we don't want to ignore them. But if you're talking to a CIO or a director of IT about these things, they're probably thinking something a little bit different, right? They are smart enough to know they're not going to get all of that efficiency for free. And so they're thinking, what's it going to take, And so, like if I was in that role, I would be thinking about it like this, I've got this sort of, without a system, like the way that we're operating today, say, I'm going to reach a certain level of productivity over time, and then I'll be able to sort of maintain that level of productivity once folks kind of roll up and roll onto a project. And that's sort of, how I'm operating currently. And then if you're telling me that we can build a design system and be more productive, right? We can be more efficient. Then I'm thinking, okay, so what does it take, right? Like there's a dip here, right? I'm going to lose productivity for a season while we focus on this thing that actually doesn't benefit our customers in an overt way, right? Visibly. But you're telling me that eventually, as individual contributors, you will be more productive. And so that person, that CIO, that director of IT is going to ask you this, right? How long does it take to get from where we are to this point where you're going to actually be more productive? And they're probably also wondering, how deep is that trough, right? Like that line that goes down, how far down is it actually going to go? Because that's going to cost some money and some time, right? And of course, all of these factors are going to vary for you inside your organization, with your team, with your executives. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is that if you go into that conversation only talking about the benefits for individual contributors without expressing that you have an understanding what it's actually going to take to get there, then they're probably not going to listen to you, right? So you got to do the math, right? You might say something along the lines of, hey, I'm going to need 3 people half-time for about 3 months. And that's going to get me enough to sort of have a framework built that we can then start to use it on the team. And it will actually make us more productive in the same amount of time than we're able to do without that. And that allows that person to actually do the evaluation, right? And lets them figure out if it's worth it. Now, I wish that I could tell you that it's definitely 3 people for half-time for 3 months, but I have no idea what that is for you, right? We've been doing this work for a while, and I don't think we've built a single design system that's the same. So they're always different. There's so many different considerations. Maybe that's something we can discuss, at the end if there's more questions there. But it's possible for you to think this through a little bit and start to plan out how you would approach it, and then share some of what the costs would be. Now, at the end of the day, what you're going to have to do is be able to measure this, right? And so as we go through these lists of motivators, I'm going to have a slide at the end of each little benefit where I talk about what it is that you should actually measure so that you can prove that it's actually working for you, right? And in this case, what you need to do is, even before you do your design system work, before you have it in place, you have to know what is the cost of us doing doing work. And so, there's lots of forms that this could take. If you don't have this kind of metric in place now before you have a system, it's tricky to kind of go back and retrofit estimate. But we actually have had customers do this. In fact, we had one of our larger design system projects we've been working on for 2.5 years now. It's a large retail organization based out in San Francisco. And they had reached a threshold of spend on the design system work where somebody higher up, kind of noticed this amount of money they'd spent. And so they started getting some questions from folks above them saying, hey, we see this amount of spend that you're spending a lot of money on this project. What is it that you're actually doing, and what's the benefit? They were asking this question, and so that internal team went to all the different folks who were now subscribers of the design system, who were using it in their product design and development. And they said, I know this is not easy, but remember that project that we did together last year where you used the design system? Could you do me a favor and just give me a rough estimate, finger in the wind, like tell me what you think it would have cost if you didn't have the system? And so they just went back to, a dozen folks internally and asked that question. And what they learned is that for every $1 they spent on the design system work itself, they got $3 back in efficiency. This is just designer developer efficiency, right? So that's a tremendous metric. Now they had to kind of go back in retrospect and ask that. But what I'm suggesting is, if you don't have a system yet, start to capture those metrics now so that you can compare before and after, right? So efficiency, definitely a benefit. Start to think about the actual costs involved, right? That's a conversation that you need to kind of be prepared for when you go to talk about this with an executive. Okay, now I want to shift to the next motivator, which is this idea of onboarding or growth. I actually don't see this talked about too often as a benefit for design systems, but as somebody who's trying to run a business and a team, what I have learned the hard way is that growth is expensive. If you run a team or an organization, you definitely understand the costs involved. But when you hire somebody new or a few folks, you have this time where you're paying them as if they were a fully productive member of your team, and yet they haven't really ramped up yet, and so they're not really producing. So you have a season where that's happening. Plus, there's a lot of hard costs that are involved with bringing somebody new onto the team. They probably need hardware. They need a computer. They may need a desk, a chair, all of those kinds of things, a display. Are you covering internet costs for them at home? Like, there's all kinds of things that might come up. And so as you grow, what you learn is that it costs a lot of money to grow your team. And what I've learned is that actually design systems can help you reduce the amount of time that it takes to onboard. And here's kind of a model that might help. So if you imagine that you've got all these folks out, on the internet who are potential amazing, employees for wherever it is that you work. We'll just call this the hiring pool, right? Anybody who could be a potential employee. As you interview those folks and bring them into your organization, once you have a design system in place, consider bringing them in on the design system team first. And what this means is that your organization, what it means to sort of start at your organization is a ramp up on the system team, which allows you to understand as a new employee, how is it that we design and build products here? This is a huge benefit because from this point on, you can transfer out to essentially any other team, right? And you can be, not only can you be very productive very quickly by, having an understanding of what that system is and how it works, but also you're going as an advocate for the system. So you're essentially coming to that new team, to that team that's new to you and saying, hey, I learned how the system works. Let's put that into practice here on this team. And the other thing that's really cool, that's a little bit of an aside, but folks who are already in existing teams could easily have time to sort of rotate back into the system team, get that good understanding, and then rotate back out. And this becomes just a really, really neat way to sort of help folks, figure out what it means to design and build products in the way that you do at your organization. In terms of measuring this, the metrics that you want to look at, really it's focused around how much time does it take for somebody who's new here to become productive. And so again, this is a scenario where I would say, track that before you have a system, right? Track it in situations where there is no system so that you can compare that before and after once you have one in place. And what you'll start to see is that, this does reduce the amount of time it takes somebody to be really productive on one of these teams. Continuing on here, we've had some fun conversations with folks about this idea of scale. And a lot of times what I in situations where I find myself saying, wow, you really need a design system, it's because there's a small team, and that small team is being asked to do massive things, right? They're being asked, we have a customer we've been working with for a couple of years now. And, first, I remember the first time we met them, I went and I met the entire UX team, the entire design and UX team. And it was, it was a dozen people. And when I had great conversations with them, and then I came out of that and was talking to the leader of that team, and they said, yeah, we have 100, I think on our list for this year, there's 140 websites that we're supposed to design and build. And I just thought, man, a dozen people, 100, I don't see how that's possible, right? If you want to work at that kind of scale, the only hope that you have is that you've got a system that makes you very, very efficient. And so the challenge is that as the scale, the amount of work, the volume of work that we expect these teams to be able to complete grows, we have this scenario where like people just sometimes think, I just need to hire more people. I want to throw people at the problem. And what's difficult about this is that sometimes that can actually have, an adverse effect. UXPin has a great design system guide. I just want to read a quick quote from this to you. It says, scaling design through hiring without putting standards in place is a myth. With every new hire, new ideas for color palettes, typography, and patterns appear in the product, growing the inconsistency and increasing the maintenance cost. Every new hire increases design entropy. And I think this is so true. And so before you start to throw more and more people at a problem, at this idea of scale, really, we need to have a system in place for them to come into so that you don't have this sort of entropy, this design entropy. In terms of what to measure here, what you want to do is in particular, the amount of work that your team can accomplish over a period of time is important. But what I've seen in terms of like how a design system truly helps is this idea of what does it take to get an idea out of somebody's head and into a state where it's actually being tested with real users. And we've had examples where what would have taken 2 months now takes 2 weeks, because the system is so efficient. It just allows people to pick and choose the right components. It's got a whole process in place for adding new components when needed. And it allows people to really put something together very quickly and get a test, see if it's actually a valuable thing to put more time and money into. There's a fire truck going by. I apologize for that. Okay, moving on. So we've talked efficiency, onboarding, and scale. This next one's a little different. It's one that I've more sort of seen on my own, just in observing the work that we've done with teams. But But as a leader in an organization, a lot of times folks are really thinking hard about the culture of their teams. They know it's very critical to have a unified group of people, a unified team. And honestly, even, yeah, it feels a little cheesy, but working towards something that's bigger than the individual. And what I've seen is that design systems can actually help with this. If you're as old as I am, then you were probably around back when the Web Standards Project was, a big deal. And what I like to think about is that, back then, we had all these challenges with inconsistent browsers. And we used this movement, right? It was really sort of an inward focused cause that we had that had very tangible external results, right? I remember building multiple versions of the same website with a little condition at the top that would say, if Netscape, do this, if IE, do this. And some of you maybe have done that, right? But that sort of standards movement was really for us, for the people who were designing and building websites. And design systems can actually be that for your team, right? They can give us a common language to speak. They can marry the designer's passion for the experience and visuals with the developer's passion for the process and the performance. And what's most important is they can actually build trust between those roles. And that puts us on the same team. So I think they can be a really unifying engagement. I've written a lot more about this. If you search for this Be Better newsletter, I'm always writing about these sort of theoretical things. But I spent an entire issue talking about how I've seen design systems create a lot more unity inside product design and development teams. The thing to think about in terms of metrics here is probably something along the lines of team engagement, individual employee engagement, team engagement. Again, you'd want to do this before and after if possible, but making sure that you're running entry, exit polls, and even what are called stay polls now, like folks who are staying, let's have some conversations with them. Why is it that you're choosing to stay here? There's, pulse surveys. There's obviously, through direct reports, there's one-on-one meetings. This can be the kind of thing that we start to really ask questions around. You've got NPS, Employee Net Promoter Score, which is another whole sort of, system for measuring the engagement of the folks on your team. And these can be really interesting tools to sort of see, are people engaged? And as we build a system and when we have sort of a set of tooling for our internal teams to use to have a common language, is that increasing the engagement that we have? Okay, so those were sort of the four kind of key internal motivators. And I want to switch quickly over to the external motivators. The biggest one that I hear here, of course, is consistency. And again, if you read anything about design systems and the benefits, consistency is one of the ones that we always talk about. And it's funny, we go through this kind of exercise, and I hope, like, so I want to show you just a few quick slides from the Nike website. If you work at Nike, no ill intent here, but I just want to show, with a very large and very respected brand, how this happens, right? So I just went out the other day and I was just flipping through, started on the homepage here. I clicked into the men's section, found a shoe that I was interested in, kind of drilled into that, added it to my cart, and went through sort of the checkout process, just clicked checkout. And essentially just those four screens, and this literally took me, like 30 seconds to do. In just those four screens, these are the four different buttons that I clicked to move from screen to screen. And again, like, this is not me, being disrespectful to Nike at all. Nike has one of the strongest brands ever, right? But the point is, even with a brand so strong, with such a well-established identity and brand standards and all of those things, even with that, this is what happens unless you put something in place to keep it from happening, right? This is that entropy, right? It just happens. Now, you and I look at this as folks who do this work, right? We design, we build things, and this drives us crazy. We say, why are we doing this? And to us, it's very clear that we need a system. But I guarantee you that your product people, your CMO, whoever it is going to look at this, and they're actually going to ask the question, does it convert? Right? That's going to be their focus, right? And so instead of talking so much about consistency, which is definitely a benefit, when we're speaking with the executives, what we might actually do is shift the language a little bit over to this idea of trust. And the point here is that when you have inconsistent experiences, folks tend to subconsciously lose trust in the brand. This is the kind of thing that a CMO or a product owner is paid to think about, right? And so there's a way to sort of talk about this that hits at what is most valuable to them. Another article, this is just a great piece by Vanessa Mitchell. And I'll just read again an excerpt from this. She said, brand trust as an insurance policy against future issues is not a new concept. Most organizations know that trust bestowed by the consumer can not only make or break business, it can also ensure you survive a problem in the future. But few achieve brand trust adequately, preferring to pay lip service rather than delve into what it really means, authentically caring about customers and their needs. And let's be honest, when your customer is sitting on your website or in your app and they're trying to accomplish a task, the one thing that actually matters is that one task, right? So creating that consistent experience, that's the work that we need to do. And design systems allow us to do that. And the end result is trust in the brand. So this is a way to sort of reframe that conversation. And here, what I think you'd want to measure would be, customer engagement. So like we talked about with our employee engagement, we can also measure this kind of thing with our customers, and the same kinds of tools can be used. There's lots of metrics in terms of time on site, activity time, frequency that folks visit. And it just depends on your organization, the things that are important to you, and the purpose of your property, your digital property. But those things can be looked at as a way to sort of check customer engagement before and after you put something like this in place. And then NPS is another, sort of whole, it's a whole sort of philosophy around how to measure that. So lots of ways to look at that. Okay, so continuing on. Recently, I think this has been a huge push, which is just this idea of accessibility. And I think, generally when we talk about this as individual contributors, we're kind of thinking about this, right? This is just a contact form on our website. So I want to build this, these little form, maybe it's like a label and an input and maybe placeholder text and whatnot. I want to build this in a way that's modular, that is accessible, and that, is something that we could sort of get the benefits of the accessible component that we've got. We could take advantage of that by putting it into a system and then getting reuse out of the accessibility. And so, we go to all this work, right? And we build this accessible form field. And we put all that accessibility goodness inside the pattern, and then it's inside the system so that as we build more forms, more inputs, we get the benefit of that, right? And that's great. It makes our job much easier as folks who are designing and building digital products. But there's also a whole other way to address this idea of accessibility with somebody who's in leadership. And that's this. So in 2017, there were around 815 web accessibility related lawsuits. In 2018, 2,300, right? So 180% increase. So this is massive. If you've been paying attention to this, you've probably read about Domino's Pizza here. All kinds of interesting conversations happening in this space right now. But what's important to know is that these lawsuits are happening all over the place, right? Large and small companies, a wide range of industries, especially retail, travel, banking in particular, and food service, Domino's as an example. And a design system is not going to fully solve this for you, but it can help us address the issue. And maybe even more importantly, it can help us remain compliant with the accessibility work that we do as we grow our web properties or our digital properties. That's the kind of message that's really going to resonate with leadership. Now, please, please, please keep in mind that having accessible components does not mean that the experience itself will be fully accessible when you put them together on a page. So in the same way that we kind of automate testing at an individual level, we need to make sure that we're testing the integration of those components too. Hugely important to remember. But you do get a good start, a good you're moving in the right direction if you do that work at the component level too. In terms of measuring, in terms of metrics, I mean, you want to make sure you're measuring your compliance, right? Again, before and after you have that system. And some of this stuff can be tested through automation. We do a little bit of that as we, create pipelines for, development pipelines for our customers. But there's a much deeper approach that's sort of more along the lines of inclusive design, right? That we really want to take in this work. And that's a much more qualitative approach, right? It's not so much about checking the boxes of the WCAG. It's about actually, observing folks with a disability of some kind using the experience. And, there's plenty of examples where just checking the boxes still actually doesn't create a great experience for folks. So we want to be conscious of that. Okay, continuing through here. Of course, the last one that I'll share is just this idea of usability. And, I think usually when we bring this up in the context of systems, we're thinking about how, solving a challenging usability problem once and allowing that sort of reuse to carry through can actually help us without having to redo that work. We're not solving the same problems over and over again. And it's definitely true, and it's fantastic. At Sparkbox, we use this phrase a lot. We say familiarity breeds usability, right? So we want to create experiences even across different brands, if necessary, that are very similar, that helps folks to understand and feel comfortable, executing on the tasks they're trying to get done. And this should be just as important to our leadership as it is to us. But we can also kind of reframe this in terms of the word, conversion, right? Like, so for folks who are really tasked with those kinds of tangible metrics, what we want to do is position the product in a way that it actually helps our customers accomplish their goals, and their goals and our goals align as a business. So we want to help them convert, and this is what your customers need. It creates a more usable experience, and this is what your business should need as well, in terms of metrics, measuring conversion, right? And this is one that's, of all the things that we've talked about in terms of measuring, this is probably the one that most people are already doing. So, but having that sort of history of metrics around conversion, and then putting a system in place, looking for that increase in consistency, trust, usability, you should start to see conversion increase. That's the goal, right? So we have sort of a starting point to take a look at, depending on who we're talking to internally. Are we talking with someone who's more focused, internally, or more externally focused? We can sort of pull from this, these various benefits, and reframe the conversation around how we talk, how we sell these things, and simply reframe them to show value in the most important places. And this has been a very sort of general approach, right? Like, all of this stuff is very unique to the organization. Another thing that you might think about as you start to get a little bit more specific in your, in you as an individual trying to figure out how to do this, this is an exercise that sometimes I'll go through, which is essentially, you have on the x-axis here, you're thinking about the individuals who could be an advocate for the project that you want. So if you're thinking about building a design system, who's really on board with this, right? And then you're looking at folks who probably don't want this to happen. They may even be considered a saboteur, right? Somebody who wants to see it fail. And so thinking about, x-axis, where is an individual that I'm interacting with? And then who has influence inside the organization, all the way from the bottom on the Y with no influence, all the way up to the top, high influence. And if you go through the individuals inside the organization that you're going to work with and start to kind of think through, where do these people fall? Then what you can see is that it makes a lot of sense to focus in on the folks in that top left quadrant, right? The people who, for some reason, don't see this as valuable, the saboteurs, right? And the people who have influence. And if you do that, what you can do is start to shift folks with influence to over to the right. You want them to become advocates for this work. And the way that you do that is you figure out what's important to them. What do they value? And you have to shape the project to show value in that way. A helpful question that you might use. I use this all the time. So sit down with somebody who you think might, not be into this, and just literally say this: hey, imagine it's 1 year from now, and we got this design system, this first version launched, and you were so thrilled with that work and what it meant, what it means for you. You wanted to take me out to lunch. What had to have happened to get us to this point, right? What this question does is it essentially just gets us away from all the little, conversations around features and even around cost and all of that stuff. And it just gets to the heart of the issue, which is what's actually important to that person. And you'll start to hear from them, if you have this conversation, ways that you can actually adjust, what's important in the early versions of a design system to show them that it can actually help solve those problems for you. Again, you're trying to turn those saboteurs into advocates. And if you can do that, your system will be amazingly successful. And if you can't do this, if you fail at this, it's going to be really hard to succeed at the rest of it. Of course, work with the advocates that you have, especially the advocates from other disciplines. One of the challenges that we have is that the words that have stuck, design system, those words as a label for what we're doing, they have the word design in them, right? And this is a problem. I mean, because developers look at that and they say, oh, that's a thing for the designers, when in reality, a design system is in and of itself a full product. It needs a full team, cross-discipline involved. That's critical for it to be successful. Another quick thing to think about, talk about your system as an enabler, not as a restrictor. Nobody wants to be told no all the time. If that's what you use it for, if you simply use it to police or prevent people from doing things, it's not going to stick. So as you do the work, you also need to do the work to elaborate on what it means to sort of truly govern a system. How do new ideas get worked into the system so that they can be spread around the organization? And so having sort of a roadmap for what is coming in the system is huge, and having release notes as those things get published and folks can be notified when the thing they really wanted is now added. Those are critical things. And again, it just comes back to treating it like a product. Instead of saying no, we want to say, hey, we'll add that to the list. And then, finally, just the last point here is just to shift the conversation from cost to investment, right? This really is an investment. And it's that chart that I showed at the beginning where, it costs some time, it costs some productivity early on, but it's going to result in, it's going to net you more in the long run. Just remember that, to kind of always take it back to this. And then for those of you who maybe are a little bit like me, you kind of got into this business because you like to build stuff, right? Like that's how I got here, and you're struggling with these ideas because you're thinking, this is not what I signed up for. I'm not a salesperson. I get it. That's who I am too. And I would encourage you though, to remember this, that design systems can actually help people, right? They can help you build better things. I truly believe that. I've seen it happen. And doing this kind of legwork ahead of time is going to allow you to do the thing you want to do. It's totally worth it. And of course, finally, you can't do this on your own, right? Like we said at the beginning, design systems don't fail for technical reasons. They fail because of the people involved. Remember, building a system means you're going to ask everyone to change how they work, and that they have to be on board for that to be the case. A couple quick URLs. If you want that survey, designsystemsurvey.csparkbox.com. I'm Ben Callahan on Twitter. My DMs are open. I would love to discuss this with you. Please, please. If you've got other ideas on things that have worked for selling, or if you just think I'm straight up wrong, tell me. I would love to have that conversation. And if you want a copy of the slides, you can go to that bit.ly link at the bottom there. I'd be happy to send a PDF version to you. Maybe it would help, as you're talking with your team about how to make something like this work internally. And again, I work at Sparkbox. We're always hiring. if you know JavaScript developers, send them our way. Vidley, I think that's all I got, buddy.
Perfect. I'm right here. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, Ben. It was very, very insightful. Actually, it's interesting that you brought up the notion of some of the articles that Mark Bolton was writing recently. And I was attending one of his presentations in Zurich in, I believe, late August. And he spoke about something that I think is really kind of in many ways defines the way how we start kind of looking at design systems these days. And he said that actually most of the time we spend talking about tooling, about the process, about the, how we're going to name things and all that, which are all meaningful and important conversations. But one of the major issues when design systems fail, according to him, is really the people. Right? If you do not have people behind you and people believing in the value of a design system, it might look shiny and beautiful and all, but it's not going to work well after all, right? So before we dive into questions, maybe one of the hardest ones I'd like to ask you first. So how do you deal with the fact that you might be kind of that champion for the design system, but you find it incredibly difficult for colleagues to be convinced that it's a good idea, that you really want to invest into it? I'm not talking about managers at this point, but maybe even just colleagues who are just who are just too busy with all the other things they have to deal, and they do maybe see the benefits of long-term improvements over time, right? But they're just too busy with their own things. They don't want to start a new project as of now.
Yeah, this is so hard. I mean, we talk about this. The image that I like to use here is that you're flying the airplane, and you got to fix it while you're in the air, right? Like you can't land, you can't stop being productive on your actual product, on the thing that your business is supposed to do, in order to do all this design system work, right? And then get it going. Like so that's a challenge, and that gets to the idea of like rollout strategies. A lot of times what we've seen is, picking some very simple things that are going to get you a lot of efficiency early on. So maybe it's just a layout system right away. Maybe it's a type system. I mean, we've worked with some very large organizations where for them to make a change in typography across all their digital platforms was a massive undertaking, right? And so just going through those products and as it's time, like, so now they've got the mandate, they need to make a type change. Maybe it's time then to say, let's do this right. Let's put a system in place. Let's replace how we're doing typography throughout this. And then let's just change it in the system, and we'll see that ripple through. And that's that aha moment where people start to see, oh my goodness, if we would have done this with our colors, if we would have done this with our layout, with our spacing, even with components, our navigation, right? If these were all constructed in that way, we would be able to make those kinds of changes, and it wouldn't slow us down so much, So I think it's got to be, in practice. It's got to be, find something where you can show that value, even if it's to your coworker, I don't know.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Actually, I mean, I have way more questions than that, of course, but I would like to prioritize questions coming from the audience. And again, if you have a questions, please write it down in the chat box, or if you happen to use Zoom to watch this webinar, just add a question on Q&A. Let's go through some of them. First of all, when we asked in a survey, so what do people think are the most difficult things? Then Derek answered that it's a buy-in across the organization, which is, exactly why we actually have this webinar in the first place.
That's it. I mean, that nails it. That's the thing, right? And it's like, one quick story. So I don't want to cut you off, but a quick story that's super relevant. One of the most successful sort of longest term customers we've had is, again, that retailer out in San Francisco. And what was interesting is our first engagement with them was probably 6 years ago. And we just were helping them sort of with a responsive redesign of a product detail page. And we spent a good amount of time on that because every one of their products went through that single template, across multiple brands. So very important page for them. So we did a lot of work there. And in that work, we were very systematic in the way that we approached it. We created those as small components, and it was all very reusable, pattern-driven code. And so what we saw is that as we were doing that work, we started having conversations with them, with their team internally, with the folks that we thought would probably be the ones to kind of derive the idea of a design system. And they were right on board. Like, they got it. They were reading about systems. They saw the potential. And so while we were doing that work with no mandate at all to do design system work, the internal stakeholders we were working with got it. And they started this process for probably a year and a half or 2 years, where they just went to every person anybody that would say yes to a calendar invite. And they internally were doing this work, this exact thing, which is building buy-in. And so that work up front that they did was really the reason that it was successful. They had so many people who were aware of it, aware of the potential way that it could impact the efficiency of their business, the consistency, accessibility, all of these things, right? And so they had really laid the groundwork for that thing to be well done. It's like, you want to have a garden, you can't just throw seeds, right? You got to till the soil. And so it's the same idea, right? And it's a lot of work. And honestly, I get it. People did not sign up to do this, right? Designers, developers, that wasn't what we signed up for. But if we want to do our jobs, that's what's required of us.
Totally, totally. I think that this just sparked a brand new conversation here in chat as well. Because Mike, for example, is saying that I just gonna say that designers, in my experience, are not seen as leaders, even when walking through some of the advice.
Ooh,
Oh,
ouch.
this is dangerous territory. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's dangerous territory.
I mean, this is
I'm not sure. Do you
changing.
want to go in there?
I mean, I'll just say this, that this is changing. This is changing. And organizations are really finally starting to see the benefit of having designers in the conversation earlier in the process and actually giving them leadership roles. And so you're right. I think probably in your experience, Mike, that's the truth. But there's a glimmer of hope too, right? I'm an optimist. So I'm looking for
Well,
where is it that it's happening, you know?
yeah. Well, there is always hope, I think.
That's right.
Well, Pawan is wondering, he has a problem. Let me just answer live. He has had a problem with onboarding because the new people come in and they feel like they know much more than anybody else and they don't understand the decisions made in the design system. So they want to change the design system and they cause more trouble than help. Any suggestions of how you would deal with this kind of situation?
I would say, so I'm going to maybe make an assumption that the design system itself maybe isn't robust enough in that situation. In other words, a system is much, much more than just a set of patterns. It's got to actually have the documentation. It's got to be the source of truth, right? It's got to be the place where you would go to answer the question, why did we make these decisions? And if it's not that, then yeah, you're just saying to somebody, work like this, and of course they're going to ask why. So without guidelines, without explanation about how to use it and why, it's, you know, the history of its design and build of its life, that all has to reside there, you know. And this is a common kind of problem, I think. And I would guess that the symptoms are like all kinds of different things that could result in just having a sort of a library of patterns and calling that a system. You know, it really has to be a language for us. And so there's a lot more to it, I think, than just being that, you know, here's how you should work, go do it that way. Honestly, new employees that are asking those kinds of questions, those are probably keepers, right? The folks who are willing to challenge the status quo. Now, obviously you have to do that within reason, right? But somebody who's coming in new maybe doesn't have a lot of authority to start with. And for them to, you know, feel like it's an environment where they can challenge their status quo and ask that question, that's actually really valuable. You want that kind of initiative. So it's figuring out how do we get that person, make them part of the system, you know, make them, help them, to give them some authority to be able to sort of help evolve it to a point where they can actually answer those questions and get that documented. And then it becomes better for everyone, you know?
Okay, that makes sense. Brent Miller is saying that he's the only designer at a product-focused company, and he worked with dozens of developers. Do you have any advice specific to the one-person deep design shop?
Oh goodness. Yeah. So, correct. I want to make sure I understand. So this person is the only designer, and they got a whole bunch of
Yeah,
devs.
exactly.
Okay.
So Brent is just one designer in a product-focused company and worked with dozens of developers.
Yeah, that's tough. You know, I don't like for anybody to be kind of the only, you know, of their skill set. Um, I would say that, and maybe this isn't true for you. I'm sorry you're in that situation, but I have learned that, you know, design and development, it's not a black and white thing. It's not on or off, right? And it's not, a lot of people draw this as a spectrum, right? They say like on one side you're a designer and then you have developer over here, but I actually don't think it's like that. It's maybe a little bit more like, you know, design on the y-axis, developer on the x-axis. And so you as an individual might be really strong on design and really weak in development, but I guarantee you some of those folks who are strong in development also have an interest in design. And so maybe to start with, you know, find those folks, right? Find the people who are they're definitely devs, that's what they're tasked with doing, but they actually care about some of the work that you're doing too. And they could maybe start to sort of become sort of a surrogate family for you until the organization sees that how important that role is and maybe starts to and grows enough to justify hiring more folks. I know that's not a complete solution, but it might at least help you to identify some folks who can kind of be on the team with you. The other thing to remember is that if you can get those devs on board with building a system, it's going to make your job a lot easier, right? So like it's a lot of work, but having them participate with you in getting it built, man, you're going to be able to do your work much quicker. So that it might actually allow you to serve, you know, a broader team, a broader dev team in that way.
Yeah, one of the things that we did actually once, because we also do a bit of consultancy along the way as well. Whenever you want to increase the visibility of a design system, one thing that desperately everybody kind of desperately wants to do is just let's set up a meeting and let's go through all the patterns and all that and components and stuff. And it never works in my experience at all. Instead, you just need to find that champion, as you said, who is just going to be creating, you know, some sort of a Slack channel where she would promote a component of the week, and she would print it out, that component of the week, and put it in the kitchen, in the back of the toilet rooms, and all that. So everybody, including the cleaning lady, a month or 2 months from now, would know all SaaS, you know, class names and all the SaaS code and all. So even then, I think, and even if you're working kind of alone, you can still try to broadcast this kind of value that you see in a design system.
Yeah. Some of the internal teams we work with have newsletters for their design system, right?
Interesting.
They have release notes, you know, when they make a change, just like a product, you know, so they have a list of here's what's deprecated, here's what's new, here's what's, you know, no longer included. They're using, you know, developer language around versioning so that people get it, right? And it's pretty cool.
It's interesting that you're saying that, because I actually saw it as well. First of all, I saw it for the very first time at Salesforce, where they introduced some sort of legacy patterns and deprecated patterns and things like that.
That's right.
And then you would introduce just a regular versioning, like we know from the regular software engineering. So actually treating design system as a product, I think, is a very interesting notion to keep in mind. It's not like something we just put aside and then let it be, right? It has to be, you know, maintained. Francisco Sanchez is wondering, which different profiles do you think the ideal design system team should have and why?
So like roles on the team?
Yeah. Who should be involved in a design systems
Sure.
team?
I mean, I have some strong opinions about that, but I would say, without knowing what your organization is and what it does, it's hard to answer that specifically for you. So what I would look at to figure that out is I would go look at product teams that exist inside the company or the organization where you work. And the same kinds of roles that you have, you know, owning, leading, working on whatever other products, digital products you have, that's the same group of roles that I would expect you to have in a fully, you know, supported design system, but it's just an internal product as opposed to an external one. That's a way to think about it. I mean, I saw a tweet from somebody at Shopify not too long ago, and they work on the design system team there, and they said I think they had 2 content strategists on their design system team, and the tweet was something along the lines of, I feel so lucky to work at a place where they value the system so strongly that we're given content people, we're given, you know, architecture people, we're given designers, developers, UXers, all of it. And so it really is a product. And I'm not saying that you're going to get that right away, right? It will take time to get to that point. But it's got to be cross-discipline. And if you go look at the surveys that I shared earlier, those call that out. You know, the folks who feel like their system is successful, almost all of them cross-discipline team. The folks who feel like they're struggling, it's owned by design or it's owned by dev, and it's not really collaborated on internally. So that's a pretty common thing we saw.
That makes sense. Just everybody, just because I have maybe 8 more questions right now at this point. Don't worry, we'll get to all of them, so don't run away, just in case you're wondering. I am going to bring up everything. And if you have more questions, feel free to bring them up as well. If you, again, have some URLs to review or so, this is, again, the time for you to bring these things up. Right, so ready for the next one, Ben?
Let's do it.
I have so many questions, and everybody has so many as well, so it's like... I'm never going to get to mine, but that's okay. It's not about me, right? Nobody cares about me. That's okay. Aaron Garcia is wondering, in your experience, Ben, what's the best tools or platform to have a living design system where designers, developers, and all kind of people can play it with it and feel engaged?
Oh my goodness. I knew somebody was going to ask this. So I said this earlier, but I kind of flew through it. So, you know, what's ironic about this is that there are so many tools in this space right now, and it's so fluid. I mean, it's just changing rapidly. Literally every day I see some new thing that's out that's going to help, that's supposed to help solve your design system problem. So I don't really feel comfortable saying this is the tool you should use. What we do is literally, like, we haven't built a single system, that is the same. It's just not the same, because the level of fluency that your team has in certain areas of tooling and technologies, design tools, all of that has to be an influence in the decision that, for what tooling and all of that will actually be used to build the system. And the problem is, if you choose some new tech stack and you go and build this thing, or some brand new tool, you're asking a lot of people to sort of, kind of come in and have to learn a whole new thing just so that they can start working in a whole new way. What we try to do, at least, is make it so easy that they can't choose not to use it. So that means, like, we've built, NPM versions, essentially, so I can, as a dev, I can just include this thing and I get all the benefits of the system, right? So that's one way. We've built, SaaS libraries, so folks can just include, and they get all these functions that give them typography and spacing, and that's perfectly built for their system. So what we're looking for is the tools that are the closest to the metal for your team. That's what we have to get to, I think. I've seen a lot of cool stuff happening with these sort of design system tools that essentially become the repository for all of the documentation. For us, at least, the ones that have been the most successful have been built with web technologies. So it's a website somewhere. People know how to use that. They don't have to install anything, and they can just go to it. That's what's worked for us.
Okay, that makes sense. Another question, which is actually the same from Hugh. So I'm going to skip that one. Sorry, Hugh, you do matter, but it's kind of the same question. The one thing that he mentioned is that he's heard of Fractal. Yeah, we've been using Fractal actually once as well. I guess many tools out there.
So many. And I know that we didn't cover all of them, but if you go look at the results of the survey, we do ask some questions around tooling. So if you're really like saying, just tell me what's the most popular, what are most people using, you could go to that survey results microsite. And if you scroll through, you'll start to see the details around, what people in the industry at least are using.
Yeah, I think that Hugh is happy. Oh, he thanks us. That's nice. That's nice.
Thanks for the question, Hugh.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, a couple more questions. I have to jump between different windows here.
Yeah.
An anonymous attendee is asking,
Uh-oh.
well, I deal with a lot of situations where a project is sold and the timeline is not allowing the design system to bake before design happens. So we end up designing a bunch of pages, and then once we're done and about to roll on the project, we build up the design system based on what has been designed. And it's a huge task sweeping through design already made and make the system and apply it. How do we approach the PMs and the POs to put design system in the sprint planning?
Oh, man.
Good luck with that, Ben.
I'll be honest. I might actually be okay with the approach that you're taking. In other words, so I think it's hard, it's impossible in my mind for you to look at a problem and accurately break it down into its smallest components perfectly the first time, right? That's not really how things work. So the process of design, the process of development will inform what the system, how the components themselves kind of break down. And so I'm actually a fan of I don't like to start. Now there's some like basic stuff that you can do, right? Like some spacing and typography and like some tooling that you can kind of put in place to help with those things. But when it comes to, actual patterns or components that are sort of a tier above that, that it feels like it makes a lot of sense to develop those as needed. In other words, things that are only used once, maybe they don't need to be a pattern to start with, right? So go through the process of designing those pages or experience flows, and then go back and look and see where there's repetition. And that's where you want to start with a pattern, right? That's a thing that's already used once. The benefit of reuse is now, evident because you see it being used in multiple instances. Whereas if it's only used in the header on the homepage, well, maybe it doesn't need to be in the design system, you know? And that's just my sort of very practical approach here. I think as a developer, my background as a developer, like I used to spend a lot of time refactoring my code, but I don't think a lot of folks on the design side, especially CSS folks, like the idea of refactoring their CSS. It gets messy, it gets hairy quick. And so I like to use the exercise of refactoring as a way to sort of, you know, do the work, get it done, and then refactor it into a more systematic approach. And so it's you sort of get double benefit of like removing redundancies, but also getting the benefit of reuse through the refactoring exercise. So there's probably a lot more to talk about there, but that's sort of my initial thought. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I think
Okay.
it does. Peter has been waiting for way too long because he asked this question, I think, an hour ago now. He's working in a product environment. You focused mainly on the digital design and development side of the design system, but I'm very curious, especially how to engage with marketing and branding, sales, and etc. These kind of departments and dedicated designers and others in those teams. Basically, we're now moving into an era where design has become digital first from being an afterthought and has flipped these dynamics around. So I find it challenging to find the best ways to take the design system across teams and disciplines from that perspective.
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully get what the actual question is, if it's just about interacting with
Yeah, I think that
design-minded folks.
the question is mostly how would you engage with marketing and branding and sales departments and dedicated designers in those teams? Because I think the feeling is here that let's see, let me just double check again. That it's challenging to take the design system across everybody. So it feels like maybe, so we're design, we're working on the interface or on the product, right? And so we have our design system, but then how do you make sure that the marketing people and branding people and, you know, sales people and maybe designers working in those departments actually follow along the design system as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend on, like, each of those is probably a little bit different, you know. Branding folks they always care about consistency. So I might approach the conversation with them around consistency, and I would go and say, hey, you're doing all this great branding work, but do you also see how inconsistent our experiences are? They're not necessarily aligning, you know? So let's solve that. We can do that together. The way that we do that is we build a system that you participate in with us. And then we're working together. We have a common language now around how to communicate those things. So that's just one example, but like, it comes back to this idea, and maybe it wasn't very clear in the presentation, but the idea that you have to figure out what's valuable to them. And you have to try to figure out, what angle do I look at a design system from in order to show that value? And then you go there with them and you say, look at it like this, you know. It's a little tricky, and but it is necessary, right? Like, this thing's not going to be successful if those folks aren't on board. So you gotta figure something out there.
And it's, yeah, you're totally right on the point, because Peter is also kind of clarifying here. So you see branding and other design considered as a part of the design system as well.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this reminds me again, I hate to keep bringing it up, but in the survey, we asked questions around what's included in your system. And so that would be really interesting to go and see. And you'll see that a lot of people are including a lot of things in their system. And the more that's in there, the more successful they report. So having a lot of stuff, you know, a lot of documentation, a lot of guidelines, a lot of brand type stuff, tone and voice, animation, all of those things, the more of that stuff you can get into this one place, the more it will start to be the source of truth.
Totally. I actually really like the idea which you mentioned, where you talked about the trust and how we're essentially trying to build up a sense of trust. And I think at many companies, at least the ones that I'm working with, very often you end up in this area. And I think that, please, people who are watching us, listening to us now, please confirm that as well. Many companies kind of focus maybe a little bit too much on A/B testing and trying to really improve things. And some people, I would even say, would tell me at least that, you know, so what if it's inconsistent? You know, we end up with proper sales. We actually know that the funnel works well. So the data doesn't lie. So maybe it's okay to be inconsistent. So what's the point of being consistent for the sake of, you know, consistency or design or ethics or, you know, anything of that kind? And then it's all about, like, does it improve conversion or not, right? And so I see some companies doing this interesting thing where they twist a little bit and change the way they look at their customers, in a way, not only thinking about A/B testing, but looking into other metrics like time to first share, time to first upgrade, time to first upsell, time to first return purchase, things like that. Kind of get a more holistic view of the customer journey, right, in the end. I'm wondering though how this kind of A/B testing, where we say, yeah, right, you have this design system, and yeah, it's supposed to be consistent, but we did a test, so that button with that color works better, so we
Yeah.
should go that direction. How do you deal in these kind of situations?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think you nailed it. There are definitely metrics we can look at to get that more sort of, customer engagement holistically. What are we seeing? But I also believe that this one is tough to measure, right? Like trust is not a thing that you can just. It's not a button in Google Analytics, So I think there's probably a more, qualitative way to look at that, which might involve, interviews with customers, which might involve, sort of just actually having some conversations with people. And I think that's probably what we need to do to be able to check that and measure that over time and start to see that consistency. I believe that consistency will increase those things, but I don't have the data to prove that yet. So I think that's a tough one, man.
Yeah, totally. But it's always, us arguing against and trying to protect the interest. And again, I think one way or the other, it's all about like having this holistic view and tracking what's happening across all these things, right? Also, we'll be happy to share some of this. Like I have a slide with a couple of metrics like that, which I see kind of companies bringing up. So I'll send it out, tweet about that later.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe 3 more questions. Maybe 4. One question that came from Aaron Garcia. In a product company with a lot of teams that eventually will use the design system, have you ever found the right balance between a dedicated team and contributors from the teams that their full-time job is dedicated to the product?
Ooh, that's a good one. I love these conversations around how should the team structure be set up and that kind of thing. It's weird. There are some companies where this is like the most important team, is the design system team. And there's companies where it's basically like, you better put your 40 hours in or however many hours we expect of you. If you want to do a system on your own time, that's fine. So there's a wide spectrum, I think the most important thing is about getting all of the disciplines involved. So I get it that you're probably not going to be able to just go hire, 6 people and they're all going to be cross-discipline full-time on the system. I've never really seen it work that way. So it's much more about like, usually kind of from the ground up, folks recognizing that there's a lot of inefficiency in the way that we work and we could be a lot better. And then, kind of those folks, finding the advocates from each other discipline that they can kind of get together and then going to the executives or to the directors and saying, hey, we think this is going to be beneficial. Here's all these reasons and the metrics that will show that. Give us a chance to try it. In terms of team makeup, there has to be I don't think you can do it successfully without somebody who's thinking about governance in particular. Like design and development, of course, you have to have those kinds of folks involved. But I think the idea of how does it evolve is probably paramount. If all you have is folks who are thinking about how to build it, and you're not thinking about how it will grow and continue to serve the organization through future iterations, it's probably going to stagnate and it's probably not going to be used. So that's got to be a component that exists there. I also think somewhere on the content side it's pretty critical. Like you've got to have folks who are thinking about, the way that we approach our customers, right? Our voice, our tone, the way that we write, the language, the character of the brand, that has to kind of be infused as well. So those things I think are kind of core to it, but it's going to depend again on your organization and what's important there.
Right, and I think it's because you said that you guess essentially we want to treat the design system as a product. it also means that essentially everybody who would normally work on a product would also be somehow involved in the design system, right? So all the different sides, they can also benefit from it. Just two more questions, and then we'll probably let you be for now, Ben.
Sure.
One of them is, so if you end up working in an organization which desperately tries to move towards a design system, maybe this is a legacy product, they have tons of developers, maybe a few designers, products are pretty inconsistent, so there's quite a bit of stuff happening, but designers actually made an effort to compile a design system or start working at least on some sort of a component library, right? And they kind of work towards like a unified design tool already at this point, but it's more like an initial state. So which steps would you recommend to take in order to get to the point where the entire team is kind of unified? Essentially, maybe drawing from the experience you had with working on projects like that.
So taking it from sort of like a baby state to a more sort of grown and mature. Yeah. Let me think. I mean, I think most, like it's actually pretty easy to go look at your product, find the inconsistencies, create some patterns. That's like kind of like the first step, right? And I'm going to come back to the thing that I think probably causes most of them to fail, which is the governance side. So the difference between that early stage system and one that's mature and actually has buy-in is the fact that it's actually being maintained and used. Without that, again, it's just going to be stagnant. So I really think that's kind of got to be step two, right? So you get something built and people have the option to use it, but it's like, if it's not actually going to continue to evolve with the products themselves, then I'm a little hesitant to use it, right? Like I kind of want to see that it's going to last, it's going to actually be maintained, and it's actually going to have people behind it that are going to hear me when I say, this is great, but it doesn't do X, Y, and Z, and take that input from me. And instead of just saying, sorry, that's not there, putting that into the roadmap in some way, right? And maybe collaborating with me to do that. And that gets me bought in, right? Now, the thing we're working on is the common language, and that's what it has to be.
Perfect. That's something we can work with. Nina is wondering, let's see, hold on just a second. So we're building a design system from scratch, and the angle that we have for buy-in at my company is improving accessibility. Can you give any advice at how you would approach the phases of a release for a design system when you're going from 0% design system to hopefully eventually 100% design system?
With accessibility as kind of the primary motivator?
Yeah, so the advice, exactly. So the main reason for buy-in is improving accessibility. And so how would you approach these phases of a release? Like how would you introduce a release cycle for a design system when you're going from 0 to 100%? So like what would you start with? Colors, typography, and then moving on to large components? Or would you kind of look into critical product pages specifically and improving them, kind of dissecting them into patterns?
Yeah, I mean, so an easy thing to do, very common problem with accessibility on digital products is just contrast, color contrast, right? Very simple to fix. And you could address this and actually show value to the right folks by doing an audit of colors on your site. And then putting together, you've seen this a million times in a design system example of just like, of colors that are relevant. But what I might suggest would be a step further than that, which would be to show how these colors can be combined in the design system documentation to give you an accessible reading experience. So what you're doing is you're kind of getting two things, right? You're getting reusable color codes, maybe some SAS functions to actually use those if you do the pre-processing thing. And then you're also getting a benefit of accessibility, right? You're also now documenting in the actual system itself so that devs, designers, everybody understands which colors can actually be used together when type is involved. So you could show these two colors together fails, these two colors together works, and even make recommendations and bubble those to the top, right? Make it easy for them to see, here's the recommended colors that we want. Something like that would maybe be a good start to kind of get the folks who care about accessibility on board, but also to show the benefit of reusability. I hope that helps.
Okay, so Nina, please let us know if it actually helps, if that answers your question as well. A few small ones before we wrap up. Hugh is asking, any good resources to learn more about NPS, I guess Net Promotion Score?
Oh, goodness. I don't know off the top of my head resources, but I guarantee you, if you Google that, you will find a lot. Okay. There's a lot of companies doing this kind of thing now. Quick Google will find you dozens and dozens of resources.
Maybe just a final question to wrap up as well. Maybe you could recommend some of the biggest mistakes designers make with design system. I mean, because you're working with so many companies, what are some of the common things that you see happening over and over that are very, very painful and that are kind of warning sign if you experience something of that kind?
Yeah, I think early on, folks tend to imagine, and in fact, I saw this sort of between the lines of Nina's question earlier, like they imagine this sort of future state where literally everything is in the system. And I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, you know? It's like if you're building a website with a CMS, do you really want every single thing to be managed in the CMS? I mean, you could do that, right? You can make custom fields for everything, but good grief, to maintain that, the amount of work is just, it's like exponentially more work, right? So you look and you be smart about what do you manage? And I think the same thing is probably true with a system, you know, especially early days. You want to be smart. It's got to be about positioning it for the right folks, you know, and showing that value early to the right people, what's important to them. So starting without that grandiose vision of literally everything and saying, hey, we're going to be smart about this, you know, we're going to be tactical. We're going to put the right stuff in that gets reused a lot, and we're going to see the most benefit for the least amount of work early on. And then as we grow and we start to see additional things that might help us, you know, we can make a decision in a smart way and evaluate whether it makes sense to put more in. I think that's probably the biggest thing. I think, you know, as always, right? Like we love to play with the tooling. We love to play with the technology, the new design tools and all of that. And I think all of those things can be great, but they're not the thing, you know? So it's easy to get caught up in that stuff and forget that really the important thing is the people, and making sure we remember there's somebody on the other side of that screen. You know, there's somebody who's going to subscribe to this thing, and I want to create, you know, low friction for them to use it. I think those things would probably keep you going in the right direction.
Sounds fantastic. So excellent, Ben. Thank you so much for being with us all this time, 1.5
My
hours
pleasure.
and Q&A and all. Thank you so much for answering all the questions. Thanks to everyone who joined us and asked those questions as well. As a quick note, please expect another live session coming up on November 5th, which is going to be, I believe it's 1 week from now. Yes, it's exactly 1 week from now, next Tuesday, where we're going to have Rachel Andrew building things that you want to build. So you suggest the layout and she's going to kind of run us through the way of how you would build it with grid. She has grid layout and probably looking into how we can maintain it for legacy browsers along the way as well. So again, please go ahead and if you happen to be a member already, go in the Slack. Oh, this noise. Go into Slack and post the URLs right there on the TV channel. And otherwise, I'm looking forward to hear from you. I'll meet you at some point in the world. And again, huge thanks to Ben for joining us, and huge thanks to all of you for joining us. And Ben, you want to send something to the world? If you wanted to change one thing about design systems for good in that world, what would that be? A message to the next generation?
The hardest question last. Oh goodness. I think the thing that I love about them is that they have the potential to bring teams together. You know, if you've ever been in that meeting where you've got your IT folks and your communications folks, and you can tell they don't like each other, or even designers, developers, right? Like this is the thing that can put them on the same page. And I love that about them. That's probably the thing I love the most. So don't forget that they have that power, and put them in place so you can see that benefit too.
All right, it's perfect. That's alignment. Talking about alignment, don't forget Rachel and you're talking about Flexbox and grid alignment next time. I'm so happy, proud of this transition. I'm unbelievable. All right, with this in mind, thanks Ben for joining us and everyone else, and see you next time. Bye-bye.